professor of literature at Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in Merrimack, New Hampshire, on the topic of Joyce Kilmer, who died a century ago today in France during the Second Battle of the Marne. So often in America, wars have centered on public figures such as military heroes and renowned statesmen. This evening, we're going to honor and remember a man who was decorated for valor, though noted for very simple verse. He was a man of humble yet noble ambition, a man of heart, and a man of spirit. I trust you leave tonight with a renewed appreciation for the life and legacy of Sergeant Alfred Joyce Kilmer. Also with us this evening are Colonel James Tierney and Lieutenant Colonel Walter Montagno, retired members of the 69th Infantry Regiment, Fighting 69, who, of course, Kilmer was a member of that unit, and they will share a personal effect of Kilmer's that he had on his person. He was wearing 100 years ago today when he was felled by a sniper's bullet. And they'll also offer a history of the 69th for those that care to enjoy that. But for now, please help me to welcome Dr. Amy Fahey for Poet, Patriot, and Knight of Columbus. Joyce Kilmer.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'd like to thank the Knights of Columbus and Peter Sonsky in particular for inviting me to give this talk this evening. Actually, the first pick was Joseph Pearce, who knew a lot about the British World War I poets, but asked if I would take on the task of talking about Kilmer. And it really has been a labor of love, as I hope you'll see by my remarks this evening. When I was first asked, I was intrigued, and so I accepted. And I knew very little about Kilmer. I know some of you in the room know more than I did at that time. I knew a couple of things. I knew that he was a he. I knew that he was a Catholic, but I did not know that he was a convert or the very beautiful circumstances under which he converted to the faith. And I knew that he had written a poem called Trees. And that was about it. And so learning more about his family life, his faith, his military career has been a real treasure, a real delight for me. And may have tried the patience of my family members on many occasions as I've related anecdotes and amusing and interesting facts about Kilmer. But it has all borne fruit in hopefully introducing and reintroducing this incredible man to the American public at, I think, a very important time. And I think the time is ripe, if not long overdue, for him to be appreciated appropriately by his nation and by his fellow Christians and by fellow poets and those who are interested in literature, as I am. 10 times thrice happy is he, rarest of men, who, like Kilmer, never penned a line or said a word or did a deed that can arise to bring confusion to those who love him. Those words were written by his friend, Robert Cortez Holliday, who penned a memoir of Kilmer shortly after his death. The Literary Digest, of which Kilmer was a poetry editor for many years, said this after his death: "The world is the poorer for the loss of a very gallant gentleman, and a poet who never wrote a line that was not pure and sweet and clean." I could multiply these testimonies of his contemporaries tenfold. And I point to, there are a couple of occasions where Kilmer is actually being recognized. One occurred just over the weekend in France, in the cemetery where Kilmer is buried with over 6,000 other Americans who perished in the same campaign. And the sergeant, it's the 42nd regiment, of which the 69th was a part of that campaign at the time. And the commander honored Kilmer over the weekend by reciting one of his poems. And that is, the poem is called Prayer of a Soldier in France. My shoulders ache beneath my pack, lie easier cross upon his back. I march with feet that burn and smart, tread holy feet upon my heart. Men shout at me who may not speak, they scourge thy back and smote thy cheek. I may not lift a hand to clear my eyes of salty drops that sear. Then shall my fickle soul forget the agony of bloody sweat? My rifle hand is stiff and numb. From thy pierced palm red rivers come. Lord, thou didst suffer more for me than all the hosts of land and sea. So let me render back again this millionth of thy gift. Amen. I find it quite remarkable that this poem was read so recently as this past weekend to honor Kilmer and to honor all of those who perished in that campaign. In that poem, Kilmer beautifully links the soldier's sacrifice, obviously, to that of Christ. But with his characteristic humility, Kilmer suggests that the soldiers, and by extension his own, for he was a soldier, his own deprivation and hardship are but a million several decades, unfortunately. God can make a tree. Now, there's a notable exception here this evening. Mike has come all the way from Frankfort, Kentucky, and he has a store of Kilmer verses in his brain, which I hope he will share with us at some point. Now, if you, as I did, I started to do when I was researching Google searches of YouTube videos to see if anybody knew any of Kilmer's poems. And it's remarkable. If you do a search of a poem like The House with Nobody in It, you will find dozens of recordings of elderly people who still have the poem, which is a 28-line poem, which has very long lines, committed entirely to memory. There were many poems of Kilmer's that were, when in the generations after his death, were routinely memorized at a time when children were still asked to memorize poetry. Not only Trees or The House with Nobody in It, but poems like Main Street, The Snowman in the Yard, The Delicatessen, and others. If these seem like mundane and rather simple topics for poetry, that was precisely Kilmer's intention. Kilmer's poems are highly democratic, anti-materialistic, full of praise for ordinary men and women, and children and their ordinary pursuits. And in his introduction to Kilmer's essays, the same Robert Cortez Holliday notes to three words that are often repeated in Kilmer's prose writings. And those three words are democracy, faith, and mirth. And so rather than march you through a year-by-year biography of Kilmer, many of those biographical details will come out in the course of what I'll say, I'd like to take each of those characteristics, each of those preoccupations of Kilmer's, and give you representative works, representative anecdotes, representative actions of Kilmer's that demonstrate his belief in and commitment to those principles that I think are so undergirded what he did in his family life, in his professional life, and in his fighting life as a soldier. So, first, democracy. Kilmer understood democracy in the best sense of the word, I would suggest, not some radical abstraction, some radical egalitarianism that would abolish or obliterate all distinctions, but an equality that was derived from each individual's preciousness in the eyes of a loving God. And he chiefly articulated this sense of individual worth in his best-known poems about people. For even though Trees is his most well-known poem, Most of his poems are about people, and rather ordinary people. One critic called him the poet of the desperately commonplace. And I think that's meant as a term of disparagement. But I would suggest that some of the things that Kilmer's writing about, ordinary pleasures like reading aloud to your children, or going fishing, or looking at a tree, are not so common anymore and not so ordinary in our day. And so Kilmer's poetry is all the more important to us as we try to reclaim and recover some of that innocence and delight in the ordinary in our own lives. One of his friends and a fellow poet, Helen Gray Cone, after Kilmer died, has a very beautiful poem called The Way of the White Souls, and I'll just quote a couple of lines from it. He chose to walk in the main street in the wide ways of men. He set wings to the common things with a kind touch of his pen. He caught the lilt of the old tune that the hearts of the plain folk beat. He might have dreamed on the far faint hills, but he walked on Main Street. So his democracy was a kind of, all of these things, democracy, faith, and mirth, are intertwined with Kilmer, as you'll see. I'll start talking about democracy, and pretty soon I'll be talking about his Catholic faith or something really funny, because these are not inseparable qualities. For him, they were inseparable and deeply integrated. He was an incredibly integrated man. He had a secretary. He did not know how to type, and he was a prolific writer, but that was largely because he always had typists. He could dictate 4,000 to 5,000 words an hour, which is kind of amazing. But he had this secretary, Watts, and Watts recalls there was only one time when he saw Kilmer angry. And that was when someone had remarked to him, shortly after he had converted to Catholicism, that the Catholic priesthood in this country was to a very large extent recruited from the sons of Irish policemen and scrubwomen, to the detriment of the ecclesiastical state. Kilmer flushed an angry red and turned on this person in great indignation. I do not for a moment admit that you are right, he said, and even if you were, then I should consider it the greatest glory of the Catholic faith, and I would feel it the highest privilege to receive the sacrament of the Catholic Church at the hands of such a priest. So he clearly identified with the common man, and this, of course, is one of the reasons that drew him to the Fighting 69th. He wanted to be with the Irish. He wanted to serve with young men who knew great rousing ballads called The Boston Burglar and all these other great tunes that he loved to sing with them. He just wanted to be with ordinary people. He was Joyce Kilmer when he enlisted, and there were many forces that wanted him, nicely squared away at a desk job where he could chronicle the war and not get into any danger and come back and pen the history of the Fighting 69th. But his desire to serve his country in the most active of ways was eventually honored because he was so tenacious in pursuing it. Part of his democratic faith is part of what he believed. He believed in the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He loved George Washington. He loved the principle of religious toleration. The last public lecture that he gave was a lecture on George Washington. It was a commencement address to a Jesuit college that's no longer exists, Campion College out in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. And he spoke there of his sense of duty to his country. And he writes to his wife in one letter, and I've got a couple of very old volumes of Kilmer's verse. The bindings are not really on anymore, so I'm going to be a little bit gingerly with these. but it's a 2-volume collection that was printed shortly after he died. And he writes in one of his letters that he, why he serves in the 69th and why what the Fighting 69th was actually doing was not waging war, but forging peace. We are peacemakers, we soldiers of the 69th. We are risking our lives to bring back peace to the simple, generous, gay, pious people of France, whom anyone must pity and admire and love. They are an invaded people, and invaded people always are right. Here are nice old ladies, fat babies, jovial, humorous men, and little girls just after making their first communions. They've been driven out of their pretty, sleepy little villages. They want to get back and mend the shell holes in the roof and go to school and take their place drinking red wine of an evening, according to their tastes and ages. Well, we men of the 69th are helping to give these people back their homes, and perhaps to prevent our homes from one day being taken from us by the same power, of whom nothing at all worse need be said, that it is an invader. And St. Patrick and St. Bridget and St. Columkill and all the other saints are with us. And this sense of indignation, Kilmer was a pretty jovial fellow, as you'll see when I get to the section on mirth. So it took a lot to get him angry. But he did have that righteous indignation side. There's a wonderful memoir by his son Kenton, who was really the only of his children who got to know his father to any extent. He was 9 when he was deployed. And the section is simply entitled Fun and Fury, because his father was incredibly fun, but when he was angry, righteously angry, it was a sight to behold. And nothing made him more angry than when the Germans sank the Lusitania on May 7th in 1915. And that act and the killing of innocent everyday folk really galvanized him, so that when Americans entered the war, it wasn't 17 days into conscription when Kilmer had signed up, even before the first draft order was over. Now, it's worth asking, and we could talk about this more in the question and answer period. At this time, Kilmer was the father of 4. One of his children had recently died, and one had been born just a few days before he was deployed. He did not need to serve. He had every legitimate reason for not serving. Several of his Jesuit friends initially attempted to counsel him against serving. So it is a legitimate question as to why he felt so compelled to serve. I'm just going to read a section because I think a lot of people think, because Kilmer was a pretty, I don't want to say happy-go-lucky, but he was a very sanguine, cheerful fellow who radiated energy and goodness, so that many people interpreted his desire to serve as a kind of recklessness, as something irresponsible. And I think his final address to Campion College, in which he talks about courage, really demonstrates that he knew what he was doing. And he eventually persuaded all of the Jesuit priests that he had legitimate reasons for going, that he had to protect his family, and this was his way of protecting his family. He had to protect his nation, and this was his way of protecting his nation, that he couldn't show up at the office every day and live with himself if he stood by and let this conflict ensue. He wrote of a fellow Irish American poet who was not serving. He wrote to his wife, "He should be over here with us, whatever his convictions may be. For it is wrong for a poet, especially a Gael, to be listening to elevated trains when there are screaming shells to hear, and to be sleeping soft in a bed when there's a cot in a dugout awaiting him, and the bright face of danger to dream about and see." But in his Campion address, he says there is really no such thing as blind courage. There can be desperate enthusiasm in battle, there can be an insane recklessness, but these are qualities that have never won a battle, and they're qualities not genuinely related to courage. The The sort of courage which modern warfare demands is the courage of the man who understands the object of the war, the object of the campaign, the object of the special engagement in which he is taking part, and of his special work in it. The brave soldier, the successful soldier, is not an automaton, but a man sufficiently enlightened, sufficiently educated to have achieved self-mastery. The true courage is not blind courage, it is seeing courage. It is stupid to speak of blind courage, just as it is stupider to say in praise of a man who fights like the devil, or of an army they fight like demons. The first army that ever was defeated was an army of demons. And that army, those who fought like demons because they were demons, the rebel hosts are now interned in hell. And heaven is full of the victorious veterans of the first and greatest of wars, of those who fought not like demons, but like what they are, the irresistible angels of God. So much for democracy. Now I'll talk about faith. Kilmer was born an Episcopalian. He was a lay reader in the Episcopal Church. His mother had great hopes that he would become an Episcopalian minister. For a couple of years, he edited the Episcopalian journal called The Churchman, and then he became a member of the Literati and quickly became a wild-eyed socialist revolutionary, attending meetings of the young radicals, and this was after his marriage. He forbade his wife from praying, and so she had to pray in bed in secret at night, and she prayed for him, and she prayed for his conversion. And it was not until their second daughter, Rose, was born, and shortly thereafter was stricken with infant paralysis, that faith came to Joyce Kilmer. He had begun a correspondence with a Jesuit priest out at Prairie du Chien, Father James Daly. And it's a very moving correspondence. James Daly was a poet, so he had a reason to contact him because of their mutual interest in poetry, but he quickly began to question him about spiritual issues. And in November of 1913, he and his wife both entered the Catholic Church. Prior to that, he says, every day on his way to work in New York, he would stop in at the Church of the Holy Innocents. Quote, just off Broadway, on the way from the Hudson Tube Station to the Times Building, there's a church called the Church of the Holy Innocents. Well, every morning for months, I stopped on my way to the office and prayed in this church for faith. When faith did come, it came, I think, by way of my little paralyzed daughter. Her lifeless hands led me. I think her tiny feet still know beautiful paths. You understand this. And when I published the article on Kilmer in Columbia, it was the first time ever in my life that I got fan mail. It was really gratifying. And I attribute it not to me, but to Joyce Kilmer, because all of the many beautiful, wonderful people who've loved Joyce Kilmer all these years finally had a reason to shout from the housetops and say, I know his work. And I received a beautiful letter from a woman named Rosaline Walters. Her full name is Rosaline Joyce Walters, and you'll see why. I've always felt a connection to Joyce Kilmer. My dad, Michael Francis Roger, knew Joyce Kilmer, fought in France, and was wounded on July 28, 1918, 2 days before Kilmer was killed. I was born on July 30th, 1935, so my dad gave me the middle name Joyce in honor of the poet. And she goes on to talk about the Church of the Holy Innocents, and she includes a photograph of her standing next to the crucifix in the church. And it's kind of has anyone ever been to this church? I have not. You have, okay, so you've probably seen this crucifix. It's famous for World War I because the painter Chambers did that famous, with the soldier kneeling and praying. It's called The Return. And it's the return, from war. And the impetus for that was when the painter went into Holy Innocents one evening at dusk, just at the beginning of the World War. His attention was arrested by a man who knelt alone at the foot of a large crucifix. The contrition expressed in the kneeling figure was inspiring, and by the light of a few candles on the simple votive stand, the artist made a hasty sketch on an envelope. So if you haven't seen this, you could look it up, or I could even show this to you, but this is the same crucifix before which Kilmer prayed every day before his conversion. So it's a really moving and beautiful story. Just a few weeks after that, later in December of 1913, he writes to Father Daly, because his daughter Rose, they've been in touch, and Father Daly's been praying for her. You will be glad to hear of our Christmas present from Soeur Therese. Rose can lift her left forearm. I know that you have been getting her aid for us. Please tell us how to show our gratitude to her and to you. Now this is beautiful because this is, December of 1913, and clearly both Kilmer and Father Daly are praying for the intercession of Saint Therese. And the story of a soul had been translated into English, but it wasn't until 6 months later, in the summer of 1914, that Pope Pius X even opened the cause for her canonization. So, and with their daughter being named Rose, and this beautiful little miracle that Joyce was so grateful for, it just is a real testimony to his faith. He had a great devotion also to St. Nicholas, who's the patron saint of children, and because he was born on December 6th, which is St. Nicholas's feast day. Now, that's not, he didn't have a devotion to St. Nicholas as a child. It's only after his conversion that he develops this devotion. And so there was a great devotion to St. Nicholas in several of the churches in France that he went into, and he loved to write to his wife about going in and asking for his intercession. His faith was integral, as I've suggested, to his involvement in the war. And I know the colonels know more about Father Duffy than I do. Father Duffy was the chaplain of the regiment of the 69th. He was the most decorated military chaplain in history, right? As far as I'm aware. And a very close friend of Kilmer's. And he actually, I don't want to say anything more because I know Colonel Tierney's going to say some things. But Father Duffy, after Kilmer died, had this to say of him. There was something of what the Scots call Fahey about him as a soldier. Fahey kind of means slightly supernatural, slightly faded. He was absolutely the coolest and most indifferent man in the face of danger I have ever seen. It was not for lack of love of life, for he enjoyed his life as a soldier. His only cross was his distance from home. It was partly from his inborn courage and devotion. He would not stint his sacrifice. Partly his deep and real belief that what God wills is best. Now, because I teach at a small Catholic college, I'm just going to take a quick moment to say what Kilmer had to say on the subject of Catholic education after his conversion. He, of course, attended Rutgers for a year and then transferred to Columbia. He was really bad at math, so he failed math at Rutgers and ended up transferring to Columbia. I said this during my luncheon talk. Columbia University has not been the kindest to her, one of her most distinguished alumnus. They host a bad poetry contest every year, and it's turned into a rather unfortunate affair in my view, and doesn't fully recognize either Kilmer's literary merit or his great contribution to our nation. But because of his association with Campion College, he had a deep affection for Catholic higher education, authentic Catholic higher education. And he recognized that there were going to be many challenges to the faith in the coming years. He was really prescient on that point. I do not say that every graduate of a Catholic college is a scholar or a gentleman, but I do say that it is easier to get a real education and lead a decent life at a Catholic college than at a secular one. And I think this last point is a little bit more cutting today than in Kilmer's day. Indeed, I do believe that the young man who is not harmed morally, intellectually, and physically by 4 years at a secular college has most cruelly overworked his guardian angel. When he gave the commencement address at Campion, he told the students, and it was a boys' college, so they were all young men, that they were all soldiers. It's interesting to hear what he says about the fight that they will undertake. It is a soldier's training that you have received, and it is as soldiers that you will go forth. Some of you will go in accordance with the traditions of Catholic manhood to bear arms against our nation's enemies. And in a sense, all of you go forth to battle against our nation's foes, although you never carry a rifle. For the forces of materialism, spiritual indifference, intolerance, cynicism are more formidable than any blast of shell and shrapnel, more terrible than an army with banners. And against these enemies you will be called upon to fight, as no young men before you have been called upon. But then he continues, but you have a mighty ally. The war itself is on your side. By a strange paradox, the tragedy of the war seems to be producing the lovely miracle of a renaissance of faith. From England and from Germany come similar reports. In its hour of peril, the world turns to the only true source of safety. The clear notes of the Sanctus bell sound above the roar of the guns. Through the smoke and dust of battle shines the sanctuary lamp, and by new and bloody paths, the world comes again upon the old road to paradise. That's just amazing. Why do we not honor this man more? I don't understand. In the final letter that he wrote it to a sister, Emertina Laurentius. She was a sister of St. Joseph at St. Joseph's College in Toronto, Ontario, and a dear friend. And this was his final letter, the final words of his final letter. Please pray that I may love God more. It seems to me that if I can learn to love God more passionately, more constantly, without distractions, that absolutely nothing else can matter. Except when I'm in the trenches, I receive Holy Communion every morning, so it ought to be all the easier for me to attain this object of my prayers. I got faith, you know, by praying for it. I hope to get love the same way. Mirth. Kilmer was deeply serious about his faith, but he also was a very playful man, a very joyous man. Mirth is a word you don't hear a lot of nowadays, for obvious reasons. We're not a very mirthful people, I would suggest. We need a little bit more mirth, a little bit more gleam in the eyes, a little bit more playfulness. His biographer, Robert Cortez Holliday, says about Kilmer, he was so unlike all other young men anyone had ever seen walking about, so much brighter and purer that he did not seem altogether real. And there's a description that I love. I love physical descriptions. I love these pictures, but I especially love this. It's his graduation portrait, the one on the right. He just seems so genial. And, there's still in a period when most poses were pretty serious, but you can kind of tell the corners of the mouth are having a hard time maintaining that. One of his friends, after he died, speaks of his eyes. Now, this passage really put me in mind of one of my favorite passages It's a passage of the poet Robert Burns talking about meeting Sir Walter Scott when Robert Burns was just a young lad of 14 or 15. And he said, I never saw, actually it was Scott, seeing Burns, I'm sorry. He looked at Burns and he said, I never saw such an eye in a human head, that there was something so blazing, so poetical about the eye. And this is the physical description of Kilmer. As to his physical aspect, he was stockily built and about medium height, and his habit of body was what I should call plump. Though later, under the stress of military drill, he changed somewhat in this last respect, and he was very proud of that, trimming up in the military. I noted at once that he had a remarkable head, well-rounded with broad and high forehead and a very pronounced bulge at the back, covered thickly with dark reddish-brown hair. But his eyes were the most remarkable feature. They were of the unusual color of red, and they had a most peculiar quality, which I can only inadequately suggest by saying that they literally glowed. It actually seemed as if there were a fire behind them, not a leaping and blazing fire, but a steady and unquenchable flame, which appeared to suffuse the whole eyeball with a brooding light. This characteristic was so striking that I cannot help dilating on it. And Kilmer loved puns. And I observed later on that this glow, this brooding and somewhat somber light, never left his eyes, even in his most weary or most carefree moments, so that they gave the impression of what I believe was the fact, the impression of a brain behind them which was working intensely and perhaps even feverishly every hour of the waking day. There's a great story about Kilmer that I think demonstrates his mirth, connected, of course, to his faith. Early after his conversion, he was trying to catch a train. He lived in New Jersey, traveled by train all the time. He wrote poems about how lovely it was to travel by train because you got to go home. And he was going to conduct an interview with a Canadian poet, Bliss Carman. And he was not paying full attention, and he dashed in front of the train. And he was dragged by the train a considerable distance, and he ended up in the hospital with 3 fractured ribs. This was Good Samaritan Hospital in Suffern, New York. Quote, he entered into the spirit of the experience with much relish. It isn't every day that one gets hit by a train, nor everybody that has 3 ribs broken. Exhilarating kind of thing when you see it that way. Robert Cortez Holliday says, he found it, quote, an entertaining thing to be at the mercy of circumstances over which you had no control. And he wrote to Father Daly, I have been very comfortable in a delightful hospital run by particularly amiable sisters of charity. And he had that playful attitude in the most trying of circumstances. You know, he would write back to his wife, this is a lovely war. He continues by relating that he'd received the Blessed Sacrament shortly before the accident. To this fact, I attribute my escape from death, since at the place where I was struck, several men had been killed. And in one of his last letters to his wife, he describes military life. Now, for reasons of censorship, he wasn't permitted to tell her all the difficult, sordid details about his military activities, but even if he had been permitted, I would suspect that he would not have done that. He mentioned in many letters difficult experiences which were very trying, and we know from his poem Rouge Bouquet, is anyone familiar with that poem? And the circumstances surrounding its composition, to commemorate his fellow soldiers who had been buried alive when their dugout was shelled. So he was not immune from very difficult experiences. And yet he writes to his wife about the war, and it rings true. It doesn't sound like he's putting on a good show for her. This is his, I believe it's if it's not his last letter to his wife, it's his second to the last letter. And it's a long letter, and I'll just quote from a very short part of it. I don't know what kind of mental picture you have of my present life. Just outside the edge of the forest of firs and spruce in which we 14 men live is a lovely meadow. There, among the knee-high buttercups, lay in the May sunshine all afternoon 3 warriors, myself being one. While we smoked, Kilmer was very fond of tobacco. He was very fond of food, too. While we smoked and gazed at the lovely valley miles below us, whilst we took turns reading from, what do you suppose, the Oxford Book of English Verse. We read Gray's Elegy, Lake Isle of Innisfree, Keith of Ravelston, and half a dozen other poems, all of which brought you most poignantly and beautifully before me. No, they didn't bring you before me. You are always before me, and with me, and in my heart and brain. But it's dangerous to write this. It draws so tight the cords that bind me to you, that they cut painfully into my flesh. Well, we are to be together sometime, inevitably, and soon, in terms of eternity. For we are absolutely one, incomplete apart, and in heaven is completeness. How unhappy must lovers be who have not the gracious gift of faith? There is to be an Homeric banquet at our house one day, the day when I exhibit to my comrades the glory of my life, yourself. You will like them all. Say a special prayer for them. They're brave men and good and splendid company. Dangers shared together and hardships mutually borne develops in us a sort of friendship I never knew in civilian life. A friendship clean of jealousy and gossip and envy and suspicion. A fine, hearty, roaring, mirthful sort of thing, like an open fire of whole pine trees in a giant's castle. Not exactly the type of descriptions you'd expect from the front. And yet Kilmer, in his final letter to his mother, he wrote to his mother regularly. He and his mother wrote a beautiful memoir of her son after he was killed. He says, I am glad that from you I have inherited the power of readily escaping from worry and work and entertaining with enthusiasm into whatever mirth I find around me, in finding good and true and merry friends everywhere. And in these sentiments, I could not help but being struck by the comparison to the patron of the college where I teach, St. Thomas More. St. Thomas More loved his family. St. Thomas More served his country. St. Thomas More was dedicated to his faith. And yet in his final letter to his daughter Margaret, sent from the Tower shortly before he was beheaded by Henry VIII, he says, he expresses his wish that we will all soon be married together in heaven. It's a beautiful sentiment. So this mirth of Kilmer's, which as I'm sure you see is so connected to his faith, to his love of the ordinary, comes out in his utter playfulness. He called his mother in his letters to her, he continually referred to her as brat or infant or child, dear infant. And it seems kind of strange to us that a man would address his mother in this way. And yet all of Kilmer's friends understood that he was their junior. He always looked very boyish. He died when he was 31, but if he hadn't grown his mustache, of which he was so proud, he would have still looked like a 12-year-old boy. And so he was just very playful, and it was a term of affection. And his biographer notes this in his memoirs, in a beautiful passage. He had a comical manner of terming his elders young so-and-so. I was 6 years his senior, which at this period of life represented a considerable difference in experience. And yet, throughout our association, in spiritual force, he was the oak, I the clinging vine. And I know of cases where this was quite as much so when the other man was something like 15 years the elder. And he talks about his last meeting with Kilmer. So long or goodbye was seldom Kilmer's parting word. It was rather a word he continually used, which would be thought of as peculiarly his as long as his memory endures, the closing word of Rouge Bouquet. And that word, for those of you who know the poem, The last time I saw him at his home, my wife and I, upon leaving, almost missed our car. As the three of us dashed after it, Kilmer stopped this car by what seemed to me something like sheer force of will. Then as he dropped away from the race, there came from him high and clear out of the night, and always shall I hear it ring, his benediction, "Farewell, children." Yes, it is even so. As the spirit is measured and the frailties of the soul are numbered, how many who knew this wondrous boy were his children? It's interesting to think of him as a child himself. His daughter, Rose, when she died, was only 5 years old. And one of his Jesuit friends, Father Edward Garichet, wrote a beautiful poem, an elegy called "To Rose in Heaven." And he expresses that now that she's died, now that she's in heaven, she's his spiritual elder. Time was, I could tell much lore to thee, life's lessons rude and wild. Now I could ask but a crumb of wisdom from thy vast and sudden sum. Thou art full grown, sweet Rose, 'tis I am the child. And I think it's interesting to think that Kilmer, when he was killed, had only been a Catholic 5 years. And so he and Rose died 5 years into that childhood. And those who knew him recognized that he had imparted to them something immeasurably greater than one of such young years could give. It was a brief life in the church. And after, he was buried in a shallow grave with a white cross, and then he was moved to the main military cemetery sometime afterwards. But back home, he had a solemn high requiem mass celebrated at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And his mother, who was not a Catholic, writes of that very movingly. It will always remain with me as a beatific vision. It seemed as though the great Catholic Church opened her arms wide and said, all this pomp and splendor I gladly give to dear Joyce Kilmer, who found his greatest comfort in his brief life with me. The illness and death of his daughter led Kilmer not to despair, but to the church. The intense sufferings of the war did not create in him a sense of nihilism, but gave him a sense of dignity and purpose. Time and again in all of his writings, in his essays, his lectures, his poems, and especially in some way his letters, Kilmer countered the growing and persistent and still with us assault on good things, on simple things, on faith and family and country. And he countered those not with pessimism or despair, but with an unflagging hopefulness and cheerfulness. In his brief activities as a Knight of Columbus, and in his vibrant witness of living out the faith. And so as we mark this centenary of his death, let us be grateful for this powerful witness to family, to country, to faith, in the hopes that we too may one day rejoice with him in the company of, quote, good and true and merry friends. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Amy before we proceed to Colonel Tierney?
Jimmy spoke about his son kind of carrying on with the writing, or at least in a type career.
Well, his son was a journalist. He was the poetry editor for the Washington Post. He was he went to Catholic University, and he was the poet historian of the Library of Congress. So he was involved in literary endeavors. He was also very much a family man. As I mentioned, he and his wife had 10 children. And what might not be as well known is that 8 of those 10 children wrote several letters to a certain famous British author, C.S. Lewis. And Lewis dedicated the Magician's Nephew, the Narnia series, to the Kilmer children after this exchange of letters. And I was looking at the letters, was it yesterday, this morning? I can't, 2 days ago. And it's a brief collection, Lewis's letters to children. And the initial letters are these really lovely, you can tell that the Kilmer children have drawn pictures of Aslan and, you know, just asked these really lovely questions, and Lewis is so generous in replying. But then as the years go on, he's responding to letters of, and the Kilmer children letters are not included, so you don't know what those letters are. Hugh Kilmer, which I think was the eldest of Kenton Kilmer's children. I'm not exactly sure of that. And it's clear that Hugh is peppering him with theological questions about the Catholic faith. And at times he gets a little irritated and says, I'm not really equipped to answer that right now. But we don't have, I'd love to get a hold of his letters to see what preoccupied Hugh. It speaks well of Lewis that he continued to respond to them. He had a lot of other things he could be doing with his time. So yes, his son did carry that on. I know you have, Colonel Tierney has met Ben Kilmer several times, who's a great-grandson, great-great-grandson. Yes, and his son. So, but I've not met any of the descendants of Kilmer, sadly. Yes?
I was at the rededication of the 42nd Division Monument in Garden City, New York. And his grandson was there as a speaker. And just to give a good thing to Columbia University presented a wreath.
Oh, I'm very glad to hear that.
Because he was a graduate, and so was William Little Donovan.
Yes, that's right.
They made a wreath. And he told my father how to write a diary. And my father kept a very good diary. And he also named my brother Jerome Joyce. But having grown up in Brooklyn, he didn't tell anybody his middle name.
Oh. That's great. Yes?
So, was his method of making a living pure writing, or did he ever work in an office? Or
As you know, as a writer, he had many methods of making a living. So he was a book editor for the New York Times, but he also supplemented his income with lecturing. He had the same lecture agent as G.K. Chesterton, and he was quite in demand as a lecturer. Yes, he did. You know, whenever his poetry made him a nice sum of money. He had this wonderful tradition of whenever he successfully published a poem, he would buy his wife a book. And he would inscribe in the flyleaf the name of the poem that earned him enough money to get her that book. So yeah, it was a variety of sources. He worked for a time doing dictionary definitions for Funk and Wagnalls, getting paid 5 cents a word. And they quickly realized they had to put him on salary because he was really efficient. So yes. Yes.
Thanks for traveling all this way, and I enjoyed reading your article too in the magazine. With all the research you've done, is there a making for a course at your university?
I don't know. You'd have to ask the dean or the president of the college, see if they'd be interested in such a thing. No, I did have the great pleasure of, I homeschool, and I taught a group of high schoolers this past year, a literature class, and we read several of Kilmer's poems, and I'd love to. I have already singled out several essays of his that I'd love to use in a writing course, because he's a great prose stylist. you know, he has the knack for, I mean, he's been compared to Chesterton and to Belloc, and very much meticulous craftsman in his writing. So, and he has fun, just occasional pieces. He has a great one-act play that I passed out to several college alums and said, we've got to put this on. It's not very politically correct because it takes on all the isms of his day, but it's very satirical, it's very spot on. So there's a lot of his writings that deserve to be more widely known. So we'll see.
Thank you so much, Amy. If you'll bear with me for a moment, I'm going to transition a little bit because Colonel Tierney has brought a video presentation that he's going to share. So I'm just going to get a little AV prep here. Colonel Tierney, would you like to come up? Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel James Tierney from the 69th in New York.
Just to give you an idea of who we are, Monty and I. Monty's name is Montagno, but it's an Irish unit, so we don't call him Montagno. I'm the honorary colonel of the 69th Regiment. Monty is the regimental adjutant. Regiments were the combat organization of the Army until about 1953 when they did away with them. And then after Vietnam, we did studies to determine why the Army did not perform as well as we had hoped. And they came up with the idea that it was because they had no link to their history, right? Because in the old days, the regiments, you'd spend your whole career in the same regiment. So they reestablished the regimental system in the Army by Army regulation. And they gave the regiment, by regulation, the responsibility for lineage, honors, tradition, and history. But it's not in the regiment is not in the chain of command. And in order to serve on the regimental staff, you must be retired from the military. We're all retired. That's why we're so old. But you also had to be in the 69. So my father and two uncles came over from Ireland. They were in the 69. I was in the 69, and my son is now in the 69. So that's what I mean about the regiment, self-regiment. So we have the mission to instill a sense of history in the soldiers. And we take the mission of lineage, honors, tradition, and history away from them so they can train to do their wartime mission. When Kilmer was a very, very well-educated, well-known, he was probably considered what would be now the poet laureate of the United States back when he joined the 69. They wanted him to be an officer. And he said, I would rather be a sergeant in the 69 than an officer in any other unit of the Army. So we used to have PowerPoint presentations and try to get the soldiers interested in history and the lineage and why they're there. But we converted it into a movie, so what we'll do is I'll show you a movie. The movie does portray Kilmer. The poem Rouge Bouquet is very important to the regiment, as Kilmer is. Jeffrey Lynn, who played Kilmer in the movie The Fighting 69th, reads the poem. He is Kilmer. Actually, the poem was read at the gravesite on St. Patrick's Day in 1918 by Father Duffy. And we have a picture of that too in the armory. And we read it all the time. But what we don't say in the movie is Wild Bill Donovan, another who Kilmer worked for when he was killed. Donovan in World War II was the organizer and commander of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And Donovan is considered by the CIA to be the father of the CIA. So there's a lot of very important people in the unit in those days and today in going back to our history. So we develop this movie and we show it to the new soldiers, we show it to the new officers that come in a way to bring them into the history of the regiment. So we'll show it to you, and then Colonel Montagno and Monty will bring around the cross, and I'll tell you a little bit about the crucifix that Joyce was wearing when he was killed. Okay, so
I'm going to start this.
listen close. If you are a new member of the 69, you are now part of something bigger and more lasting than yourself or any one person. You are now part of the unique story of the Fighting 69. Wear your DUI with pride.
Oh, that's a heck of an
Waterford is Ireland's oldest city. Thomas Francis Marr has always been a popular figure here in Waterford County and the southeast of Ireland. But it hasn't been until recently that events started taking place in Waterford city centre to officially commemorate one of Waterford's most famous citizens.
On the day Thomas Francis Marr presented the tricolour flag in Dublin, William Smith O'Brien, the leader of the Young Irelanders, called for raising an Irish brigade in New York City and training that brigade in the New York State Militia, today's National Guard. Within weeks, independent Irish companies were formed, which evolved into 3 Irish regiments.
By the 1840s, mandatory militia service had gone away. Instead, the states relied upon volunteer militia companies. And these units became quite popular in the 1840s and the 1850s, and they are truly the beginnings of the volunteer military system that we have today with the National Guard.
The 69th Infantry Regiment traces its lineage and early history to these 3 regiments, all located in Manhattan. In 1854, 3 regiments were called the Irish Brigade of the New York Militia.
One of the underlying purposes of the 69th Regiment was a training ground for those immigrants that hoped one day to return to Ireland and fight for their liberty from the British.
In the fall of 1849, Michael Corcoran left Ireland, came to New York, and enlisted in the 69th Regiment as a private. He had been a revenue officer in Ireland, but at the same time, he was a member of a rural guerrilla group known as the Ribbonmen. Corcoran enforced tax laws during the day, but at night, he harassed landlords by killing their livestock and burning their barns. Corcoran was 6'2", which made him easily recognizable. When he came under suspicion for seditious activity, he decided to leave Ireland and travel to New York City. By 1860, he was in command of the 69th Regiment as its colonel. In 1860, Queen Victoria sent the young Prince of Wales on a state tour of Canada. He was invited to visit New York, and the state ordered a parade on October 11th in his honor. Corcoran refused to march with the regiment. Because of his refusal, charges were brought against him. Corcoran, now the hero of both the Irish community and the regiment, was presented with the first of its green flags, known as the Prince of Wales flag. Corcoran's court-martial continued until April 1861, when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. The court-martial was dissolved, and Corcoran led the 69th Regiment in the first major battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run. During that battle, the 69th carried the Prince of Wales flag. Corcoran was captured at Bull Run and would spend a year in Confederate prison. Thomas Francis Marr, as acting major, led the regiment home. On his way to New York, Marr met with President Lincoln and asked him to form an Irish brigade. Lincoln agreed and promoted Marr to brigadier general. Marr was appointed commander of the Irish Brigade. The Irish Brigade carried the 69th's 2 other green flags, the 1st and 2nd Irish colors. 69th Second Irish Fellow was presented by President Kennedy to the Irish Parliament in 1963. The colors can still be seen today at the Leinster House, seat of the Irish Parliament in Dublin, Ireland.
The Irish Brigade was led in the battle on that occasion by Brigadier General Thomas F. Maw, who had participated in the unsuccessful Irish uprising of 1848, captured by the British, and sent in a cruise ship to Australia, whence he finally came to America. In the fall of 1862, after serving with distinction and gallantry in some of the toughest fighting of this most bloody struggle, the Irish Brigade was presented with a new set of flags. In the city ceremony, the city chamberlain gave them the motto, "The Union, our country, and Ireland forever." Their old ones having been torn to shreds by bullets in previous battles, Captain Richard McGee took possession of these flags on December 2nd in New York City, and arrived with them on the Battle of Fredericksburg, carried them in the battle. Today, in recognition of what these gallant Irishmen, and what millions of other Irish have done for my country, and through the generosity of the Fighting 69th, I would like to present one of these flags to the people of Ireland.
Upon returning from the Battle of Bull Run, many of the soldiers of the 69th Regiment, New York State Militia, similar to today's National Guard, joined the newly formed 69th Infantry Regiment, New York State Volunteers, which was a federal regiment. The federal regiment was the first regiment of Mar's Irish Brigade, and it fought in all the major battles of the Civil War. We shall march to the top, give them 2 volleys, and then go in with the bayonet. The color bearers were killed, and their flags fell. Most of the men in the front rank fell. The regiment reeled from the shock of the rebel volley. In the distance, General McClellan and his staff watched the Irish Brigade's attack. Seeing the flags fall and the Irish line halt, a young staff lieutenant cried, "The day is lost, General. The Irish fly." McClellan was silent for a moment, and then said, "No, no, their flags are up. See, they are charging." On December 2nd, 1862, the first Irish colors of the regiment were returned to New York. Since they did not have their green flag, the soldiers of the regiment placed sprigs of boxwood in their hats. As the 69th approached the wall on Mary's Heights, a Southern Irish regiment from Georgia cheered, and then mowed them down with rifle fire. Not a man reached the stone wall. The regiment almost ceased to exist, but the enemy found the body of the 69th man nearest the stone wall. Each year on St. Patrick's Day, members of the regiment wear sprigs of boxwood in commemoration of that battle. In December 2012, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 69th Infantry, participated in the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Fredericksburg, along with representatives of the Irish Defense Forces.
Honestly, the Irish, when they came here after the Great Famine, were not well received in this country. And one of the things that came out of the Civil War, and what the Irish Brigade did here in Fredericksburg in 1862, was begin to change that attitude through their sacrifice, that Irishmen were giving up their lives and making great sacrifice to basically restore the nation as we knew it.
These 1,200 men who sacrificed everything and brought into the whole country, and I think it changed the course of their history.
At about Early in the afternoon on July 2nd, 1863, during the Battle of Gettysburg, Colonel Kelly, commander of the Irish Brigade, asked Father William Corby, one of the chaplains of the brigade, to give his soldiers general absolution.
Interesting thing is many of the men in the Irish Brigade don't really talk about it very much because I think the events that were coming superseded that. But people who observed it were struck by this moment of the whole brigade kneeling down, Father Corby standing on a rock, giving the men absolution with the sounds of battle raging behind them.
Dominus noster, Jesus Christus, vos et salvet, auctoriate.
After the Civil War, Father Corby went on to become the president of Notre Dame University. While the 69th Regiment, New York State Volunteers, was engaged in the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the other regiments in our lineage, the 69th Infantry Regiment, New York State Militia, was in Pennsylvania to help stop the Confederate invasion of that state. It was recalled and sent to New York City to assist in putting down the raging draft riots.
And sometimes this brought militiamen in direct conflict with other people in their own community, sometimes even their own family members. One of the best examples of this was the use of the 69th New York to put down draft riots of 1863, which was duty that they did not like, did it with reservations, but nevertheless performed their duty.
Late in the afternoon of March 7, 1918, in the Rouge Bouquet sector of France, near Lunéville, the enemy shelled the 69th trench position with heavy mortars. A direct hit on the dugout buried Lieutenant John Norman and 24 men of Company E. Major Dubman and members of the regiment worked through the night to rescue the trapped men.
Sergeant, get your men to lift this beam. You can't get out of it, brother. The whole place is going to shake dead in a minute. Go on, Duffy, Patriot. Yes, sir. Right, Father.
2 were saved, and the bodies of 5 were recovered. The rest, including Lieutenant Norman, could not be rescued. Their bodies were buried under the dirt and rubble of the collapsed dugout. The affair is commemorated in Joyce Kilmer's poem entitled The Rouge Bouquet. The poem was read for the first time at a service conducted for the men by Father Duffy on Sunday, March 17, 1918, St. Patrick's Day.
Perhaps that brave young spirits hear the bugles sing. Go to sleep. Go to sleep. Slumber well, where the shells screamed and fell. Let your rifles rest on the muddy floor. You will not need them anymore. Dangers past, now at last. Go to sleep. And up to heaven's doorway floats from the wood called Rouge Bouquet a delicate cloud of bugle notes that softly say, farewell, farewell.
The Rouge Bouquet is read at memorial services for members of the regiment, including a memorial service each year at the 69th Regiment Monument in Calvary Cemetery in Queens, New York. The first full-scale effort to recover from the Japanese some of their strongholds in the Central Pacific was the expedition to the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. The transport ship Calvert brought Colonel Gardner J. Conroy, commander of the 165th Regiment, the Fighting 69th, to the northernmost atoll, Macon.
I'm singing a song, it won't take long, of the Fighting 69. They're a band of men brave, stout, and bold, from Ireland they came. And they hailed the leader to the fore, and Cartwright was his name. It was in the month of April, when
regiment assaulted, they began to receive small arms and machine gun fire from the defenders. The soldiers were surprised to discover that even though they were assaulting the beach at high tide as planned, a miscalculation of the lagoon's depth caused their landing boats to go aground.
Singing, here's the boys who fear no noise. We're the Fighting 69. That was it.
Macon was taken, and the regiment would go on to fight in Saipan and Okinawa. One of the regiment's traditions was to hold a beefsteak dinner the first Friday in November. In the 1970s, the annual beefsteak dinner was changed to the Macon Day dinner in recognition of the brave men who participated in World War II. Veterans of Macon attend the dinner each year.
On September 11, 2001, the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan was attacked by terrorists, killing nearly 3,000 civilians. The 69th was self-activated by its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Slack, and was the first military unit to arrive at Ground Zero. The world had changed forever, and new chapters were to be added to the 69th's history.
I knew 5 people personally that I've been friends with at one point or another in my life who died in the towers on September 11th. Ashes, flames, smoke, firemen, grief-stricken rescue workers. Fires were still burning at number 7. Fire was still burning in the pit at the site of the World Trade Center itself.
The regiment was assigned for deployment to Iraq in March 2004 and arrived in country as part of Task Force Wolfhound in October. It successfully accomplished numerous missions along Route Irish and in Taji and other locations before returning home in September 2005. Tragically, the 69th suffered the loss of 19 of its own while in Iraq. The regiment was not deployed to Afghanistan as a unit, but its members served with pride and honor with other units on 2 occasions. Over 300 members of the 69th served with other units in 2007 to 2008, suffering the loss of 4 members. Other members were deployed again to Afghanistan in 2012 to 2013, all of whom returned safely. While not official, members of the 69th proudly flew its green flags each time.
We're weekend warriors. September 11th happens, and we are soldiers.
Everything just changed overnight.
Makes sense north Canary Taji. There were bombs buried under every road. Guys would load up their cars and drive next to them and boat. And people were burned up a lot of them. You can hear them scream. It incinerated just about everybody inside. All told, 7 soldiers were killed on that.
It was just difficult moment.
And at that point, we had the choice to either give up or accept the fact that we may die anyway, and then go back out after the end fight and find the guys who killed our friends.
It's part of the heritage of the 69th that is very closely tied to the Irish in New York City. Today, the 69th is made up of other minorities, which is part of its history also.
We have a guy from Czechoslovakia, we have people from the Caribbean, people from China. That's a very effective unit because of its diversity. People deal with different cultures in different ways because they have the experience in dealing with different cultures.
The 69th at its heart, obviously starting out as an Irish immigrant organization, is now, and always has been, an organization built of immigrants. No matter where it's from, they're an organization of people that have come from somewhere else, that are based out of New York City, that have come together to fight or to serve, and that's been the same throughout its history, whether they've been Irish immigrants in the beginning, or now from Latin America, South America, Caribbean, wherever the immigrant population of New York City, whatever that flavor is, that's the flavor of the 69th.
The great thing about the 69th is that, unlike a lot of other Army units, we still remember our past. It's on display as soon as you walk in the front doors of the Armory. It's taught to our young recruits, even though we've gone from a very Irish base to more along the lines of the ethnic base of what New York is now. We still remember where we came from. We're an immigrant infantry battalion, so to speak. We take in New York's youngest and try to make them men.
One of the things that's so special about the National Guard is that we create relationships and make friendships that are within our community and that we can keep forever. It's powerful across the National Guard, but in a unit like the 69th Infantry that has such a long and proud tradition and such a long and proud heritage, those friendships and those relationships are not only close because of our National Guard bonds, but they really stretch through generations and allow us to reach back to our predecessors and channel them into everything that we do, and it makes us a very strong and unique regiment.
The 69th Infantry Regiment has a unique history and many traditions. And it's the history and traditions of the regiment that bond the soldiers who came before to the soldiers now serving, to the soldiers who will follow in the future. The Fighting 69.
So you have some idea. You have some idea why Kilmer wanted to stay in the 69th mission. He'd have to go to another unit. But Joyce was wearing his crucifix when he was killed. He worked for Donovan. And when Donovan's adjutant was killed, Captain Ames, at the Battle of River Oak, the same battle that Joyce was killed in, Joyce volunteered to take over Captain Ames's roles and responsibilities. And he went out one night on a patrol and was shot in the head. Father Duffy and Donovan took the crucifix off the body, and Donovan wore it for the rest of the war. And he brought home the crucifix, and he hung up a picture of Kilmer in his office, the regimental headquarters. Now it's the commander's office, but at that time it was the regimental headquarters. And he put the crucifix on it. And when we went to World War II, they mentioned his name. Gardner Conroy took the crucifix off and put it on. We went to Macon, and Conroy was killed. wearing the cross. So his driver took it off, and he kept it. And about 40 years later, he brought it back to the armory, gave it to Colonel Slack, and Slack put it back on the picture. And it stayed there until they deployed in 2004 to Iraq, and Slack wore it through the war. And then when he came home, he continued to wear it as he was in command. His deputy, Colonel Crosby, took over the battalion. He wore it all the time. The next two commanders either wore it or carried it with them at all times. But you'll see that the crucifix is deteriorating. They lost, more and more of it. And what we had to do is put it and have it framed. But if you take it, where is it now? Is it over?
Thank you.
Take a closer look at the crucifix. When you get, there's a skull and crossbones on the bottom of the crucifix. You missed it. And it was the cardinal in New York, Cardinal Eagle at the time, sent down a Catholic priest, assigned him to the 69th National Guard unit. We had a full-time Catholic priest, captain, and he was around all the time. So we were out one night, and the commander, we were out in an Irish bar in Manhattan, and the chaplain was with us. And the commander had the crucifix, and he was showing it to the owner of the restaurant. And he said, the commander said, "Now, what is the meaning of the skull and crossbones? I never heard of the skull and crossbones." Does anyone ever hear that? Besides people I talked to today. And it goes back to Golgotha, right? His place of the skull. Adam was supposed to be buried in Golgotha, underneath, in the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And they found the skull. It was supposed to be the skull of Adam. So the chaplain said, what a great tradition and history the Orthodox have. They believe that, that's Adam's skull, number one. And number two, the blood, Christ's blood dripped down, and when it hit the skull, the original sin gets forgiven. So that's why the skull and crossbones is an interesting story from my point of view. But so it hangs now in the commander's office, and we're lucky to be able to take it out. It's one of the priceless artifacts that we have. So if you have any questions about Joyce's military life, maybe I can help you with poetry, other than But I was, besides, I was a historian. No, I was the colonel of the regiment at the time. And I was also the president of the Officers Club, and I was also one of the trustees of our 501c3. And I live in Virginia, so I go to New York every week. And I drive up, and I got a call from the building superintendent. And that's never good, It's usually, they were in a club last night, and he left the bathroom, phone rings. What do you want? Something, I'll go. I'd like to see you when you get in. I said, okay. So I walked in the armory, and he said, well, come with me. All right. So I walk outside, and they're big, if you've ever been in the armory, it's a big open space on 25th Street Lex. Covered by a roof, but it's huge. And Victoria's Secret is filmed in. Right? Monty and I always attend the rehearsals, but no more because the armory's closed to civilians now. But the riggers were all up in the ceiling putting the lights on, and they were building the stages. And the guy who heads up security for Victoria's Secret, we know, because he always lets us into the rehearsals. But, so, the superintendent calls up to and there's hundreds of people working all over, climbing around the rafters. The rafters are about 4 stories high, And he says, he's here. I said, no, what's going on? So he comes down, he goes, so this guy, is one of the production managers. This is big money. This is, they spend millions and millions on a 1-hour show. And they're there for a week, setting up and ripping down, right? Big time. So this guy's running. And he goes, come with me. So I go over, and one of the riggers is there. He's wearing like a civil defense helmet, one of the tin pots, got the gloves and the belt and everything. So he goes, tell him who you are. So the guy goes, I'm Ben Kilmer. father was a member of the unit. He didn't realize, because in World War I, they changed the name of the 69th Infantry. They changed the name of all the National Guard regiments to the 165th. And knew his great-great was killed in the 165th. He worked in the 69th Regiment Armory many times, but he never realized the 69th Regiment Armory was also the 165th in World War II. It was President Kennedy who put the name back to the 69th in 1963. But, so one of the World War I huge tapestry that hangs from the drill floor has 165th Infantry. He told the production manager, he said, that's my great-great-grandfather. What was his name? He said, Kilmer. Now, we had oriented all the big guns in Victoria's Secret, you know, and we explained, took them around on tours. So they all knew who Joyce Kilmer was, but they didn't realize, he didn't realize he was there. So we touched base, which we tried to get him here. We emailed him, but, you know, I don't have his telephone number, but he's marched with us on St. Patrick's Day. We have the children of the 69th and regimental headquarters right behind the battalion. And Joyce has a son with him and he marches with his son. I'm sorry, Ben has a son with him and he marches with his son on St. Patrick's Day with the regimental headquarters. So he was at the dedication, someone was at the 42nd Infantry Division dedication, and that was the historian of the unit, because I was a historian for 10 years and then I became the honorary colonel. So the historian works for me, but about 6 weeks ago, his wife came down with very advanced lung cancer. We just discovered it. So he's been kind of out of the net, so we couldn't get into the archives and maybe bring up some other stuff. And he would have been here tonight. He was with Ben at the dedication of the 42nd Division Monument in Garden City, the historian of the unit, Bert Cunningham. But one of the men in my neighborhood lived in New Brunswick, and he remembers the tree. He said it was when he was a kid. A beautiful tree that Kilmer wrote a poem about, and then it got diseased, and they cut it down. But he collected acorns from it when he was 5 years old, brought it back to his father's house and planted them, the oak trees, right? And then in Hurricane Sandy, he lost them all, but he cut up slices of it and brought them down to Virginia, and he gave me the slice for the regiment. So we have it in the regiment, but it's in the archives. I really couldn't call it Bert. Say, hey Bert, come on in the archives. You know, so we leave Bert alone. But we have a slice of a tree grown from the Kilmer tree. It's really,
Questions for Colonel Tierney? Anyone?
So he's buried in France.
I mean,
He's buried in
he's
France.
buried in France.
Did his family have the option? I know sometimes the family would have the option to bring the body back. They just wanted to leave it with the regiment there in France, or?
I don't know if they had that option in World War I. I know that I went to Normandy. My youngest son is in the 69. My oldest son is in the Virginia Guard, in the 3 of the 116th. The 3 of the 116th is in the 29th Infantry Division. They were the first battalion, the first regiment to go ashore at Omaha Beach. Right? They were destroyed. You saw the movie Saving Private Ryan? All those guys that were killed? That's the 3 of the 116th. Right? Civil War, they were Stonewall's foot cavalry. They were part of Stonewall, they call them foot cavalry because Stonewall Jackson marched them so fast. So I went over there in Normandy, and I was taking a picture of everything from the 3 of the 116th, even though I'm a 69 guy. But for my son, and I went into the museum, you know, in the cemetery. And I'm walking around taking pictures of all the guys that they have from the 3 of the 116th. And they have Joyce Kilmer there in Normandy. They have Joyce Kilmer. He wasn't even in World War II, you know. He's not buried there, but I mean, he has that much respect in France and in the American cemetery and in the American Army. And most people, the guy who got the tree, when he was telling me about it, he goes, yeah, I have the Joyce Kilmer's thing. She wrote trees. I said, no, she did not write trees. She was a saga larger than the 69. Harry was in the 69. Yeah. Well, they are, you know. But, yeah, so I don't know if they had the option. But now I saw, was it MacArthur's son, Monty? MacArthur's son's buried there, isn't it? In France, in Normandy, didn't he? Was it?
Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, I'm sorry, it was Roosevelt. Roosevelt, both of them are buried there. There's a little plot there with the Roosevelt in it. Now, why didn't they go home, you know? You would think that they could go home.
Well, Clinton was killed in
Yeah.
World War I, and he was buried there, and actually, just shortly after D-Day, his brother, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., died of a heart attack in and around Normandy, and was buried next to his brother.
Right, yeah. No, I was at the graves too, so it would be nice, yeah, it was Roosevelt.
Well, I think he commanded the 29th Division.
Oh, he was the assistant division commander, is what I'm talking about. His son.
Yeah, he had like a heart attack 3-4 weeks after sunset. He died shortly after a heart attack. He was assistant division commander of the 4th Infantry.
Yeah.
The 4th and the 29th were.
Oh, it was the fourth of them, yeah.
With the,
Well, our chief of staff in World War I was MacArthur. This
the
is
42nd Rainbow Division chief of staff was MacArthur.
Yeah. This is the Army Staff Identification Badge. If you worked on the Army staff, you know, the Pentagon, for a year, and you don't step up too far out of line, they award you the Army Staff Identification Badge. This was designed by MacArthur when he was assigned to the Pentagon. He wanted to recognize Army staff officers, so he designed that badge. And it really is a beautiful badge. When he was a lieutenant colonel working in the Pentagon, came up with the idea of the Rainbow Division, which was going to be made up of all the best National Guard units in any of the states. And it would be a rainbow across the country. So they made him the chief of staff of the Rainbow Division. So, I mean, there's 1,000 stories you could tell about the division and the regiment, but I'll tell you one, which is, I think, a little comical. Now, Donovan is a very strong leader, right? And considered by the CIA to be one, the most highly decorated soldier and officer, at least soldier in World War I, Donovan, and two, the father of the CIA. But he was never in the CIA. He was in the OSS, which was much more powerful. The Office of Strategic Services. He organized it, he commanded it through the whole war. World War I, he's a very good friend, Father Duffy and MacArthur, right? Very good friend. Donovan is crossing the River Ork, and he's wounded. Captain Ames runs up to grab him. He's shot, he's killed, and he's a very close friend now of Donovan. Donovan's very upset. Kilmer volunteers to fill in for Ames. He's killed. And the artillery support that Donovan was getting, he did not like. And we know that he complained to the chief of staff of the division, MacArthur. And we know that MacArthur went down to the battery commander, who was supposed to be supporting the 69, but they ripped his head off. And it was a Missouri unit. A Missouri unit. Yeah. Commanded by Captain Harry S. Truman. Now, I'm not saying that that is why, as soon as he got in, he disbanded the OSS. Would not allow Donovan in the OSS, even though if you go to OSS, I'm sorry, you go to CIA headquarters, it's everything's Donovan, everything is Donovan. And I'm not saying that's why MacArthur was relieved, but, you know, you can take it from there. Any questions about the crucifix or anything else?
Well, no, just where's your headquarters in New York City, and is it open to the public or any hours? Or?
We have a display, very similar to this. You know, we have things from the Civil War, World War I. Beautiful building. It's really a gem that people don't know about it. About December 2 years ago, they closed the armor to civilians because of lead dust. The National Guard Bureau decided not to accept OSHA's standards for lead dust, but rather HUD's for residences with children, which is like 40 times more difficult. Of course, the armor is opened in 1906, when all the plumbing was lead, when the vehicles on the drill floor were spewing out the lead, gasoline, when all the paint was lead, And we had rifle ranges and pistol ranges in the basement, so what more would you want, you know? So all the armories failed, and they closed them to the public. The soldiers still go. We have, but Monty and I can go, but the veterans can't get in the building. The families can't get in the building. So in the old days, we would invite you down, we'd take you for a tour, show you all the stuff, show you Donovan's uniform, show you Kilmer's picture where the cross hung in the commander's office. Yeah, show you the green flags. The Prince of Wales flag, which is the one they carry at Bull Run, hangs at our office. See, we keep the white screen down because the Prince of Wales flag's behind it. We had lost the first Irish colors. That was the one right before Kennedy gave the flag. We couldn't find them. And we're working with the state, and they would take one flag a year and they'd send it up to People's Island, and it'd take weeks to unroll, you know, because they would hanging, wrapped up for 60, 70, 100 years, you know, so. And Bert called me up, the historian. He says, oh, they're going to pick a flag. We're going to do one of the World War I. I said, wait a minute. We have a green flag that we couldn't unroll. FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology, came in one summer, and they took the flags out of the cases. They were all wrapped in acetate, if you can believe the name of that, right? These are silk flags from the Civil War, wrapped, standing in these big cabinets, you know. So actually what happened was when one of the previous regimental commanders, he was a two-star now, right? And he was my battalion commander, Monty's battalion commander, Bert's battalion commander. We were all back in the same battalion. And he was a lieutenant colonel, and now he's a major general. And he appointed all the big gun. He's now a regimental colonel. And he's having a regimental meeting in the units in Iraq. And he wants to walk him home. We're not going to do what we did in Vietnam. Yes, General, sure. And he goes, 1986, the CIA did a thing on Donovan. And we gave him his uniform, his Medal of Honor, the letter that he wrote, we gave him all this stuff. And he said, but they had a lot more stuff. It wasn't just our stuff on display, you know. He said, Tierney, you live in Virginia. Now this is 2004, he's talking about 1986. He said, call the CIA, and see if you can find out where they got it, what they have, and will they lend it to us? I said, oh, okay, General. You know, the man's going senile. So, listen, I retired from the Army. I spent 20 years in active duty, just got off active duty. So I go home, CIA.gov. I mean, everything's .gov. I live in Fairfax, so public relations. We have a telephone number. So I call the public relations office and I say, listen, I'm a retired Army colonel, and I'm working with the National Guard unit in New York City. And we have something in common. That's all I said. And the woman on the other end of the phone said, oh, you're from the 69, Wild Bill Donovan. And I said, how did you know that? She goes, you called him the CIA, you know. And I said, no, really, how did you know that? She goes, I just finished a paper on Donovan and the 69, so I know it well. And I told her what we wanted, and she said, well, you must come in and talk to our museum director. I said, you have a museum? And she said, yeah. I said, is it open to the public? And she said, of course not. So she said, her name is Tony Hiley. I can't give out her number, but I'll have her call you. And she did, and they brought me to CIA headquarters, and they took me around, showed me all the Donovan stuff. And I told her what we wanted to do, and after we had a big discussion, she said, the more I hear about what you are doing and what your plans are, we wouldn't lend you anything. You know, you guys need professional help. It's my thing, you know. You need professional. I said, we have no money. She said, you're in New York City. There's master's programs for museum studies. You've got hundreds of museums. Ask for help. You'll get it. And I did. We brought in about 17, 18 museums, and they all said, get those flags out of there. And FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology, their master's program in fabric restoration and design, came in and spent the summer working with the students. They took the flags and they they unrolled them if they could, and they put them in Mylar, and they built custom boxes, and I mean, really, this is hundreds of thousands of dollars of man hours and work, I mean, and detailed studies. And they were in a room, and it was very hot, no air conditioning, right? Monty was there every day with them. But there was one flag that was so delicate, they wouldn't unravel. And it was a green flag, but we didn't know what it was. And we had an inventory of the flags and pictures, and they documented everything, and they told you everything about the flag and what condition it was in and whatever. But we had this one flag on the pole, we didn't know what it was. So Bert called me and said, we're gonna use the flag number 53, it's, you know, the carriers are. I said, Bert, it's a green flag. We don't know what it is, but it has a shamrock showing. Now the first time, you know, the story was that they took the first Irish colors out of the case to film it, and it deteriorated. And just, that was, you know, the story. They took a picture of it, and it was gone. And it was lost for 50 years. So I said, well, let's give it to the state, and let's see what happens. So the first thing they do is they put it in in a freezer for about 2 weeks to kill any bugs and things like that. And then they just let it rest, and then day by day they try to unroll it. And it was the first Irish colors, and that's the green flags of the Irish Brigade. But they carried up until Antietam. After Antietam, they were so shot up. Like, that's depicted in the movie. 8 color sergeants who were killed carrying that flag at Antietam. You know, because they're the target, you know. I mean, in those days, you know, that's how you communicated. You went the way of the flag. You know? And the guy who picked it up and charged, right, was Captain, what's his name? He's Waterford guy. Anyway, try to think of the movie he's in. It begins with a C. No, today.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll think about it. He's a big movie actor, and that's his great, and he wants nothing to do with it. Huh? No. Oh, I can't even think of it in the movies again. But I wasn't one of those big fans. But another Waterford guy, Ma was a Waterford guy, another Waterford guy. George Clooney. Yeah, Captain Clooney. And he picked up the flag, and that's when, what's his name, the leader of the Union forces, McClellan says, no, the flags are up, they're charging. And that was George Clooney's ancestor, who was killed carrying the flag, you know. He was carrying, I think, the 88th flag. But they all had the same green flag. But now we've been negotiating with Ireland. We were supposed to bring the second Irish colors back to New York. We have the first Irish colors. We have the American flag that they carried with it. We have the 88th green flag. Notre Dame has the 63rd green flag. Notre Dame, the head of the history department, is going to come in, we're going to do lectures and have all the green flags and the American flags they carry together to unite the Civil War flags of the Irish Brigade. So if you're a Civil War guy, this is a big deal. Plus, we have the tricolor. Now, Ma's tricolor, Ma created the tricolor that hung over the GPO, the General Post Office, in Dublin in 1916. That's in New York, and it's the American Irish Historical Society. We're going to have that one, too. So if you're Irish, you know, it's another big thing. So we're going to do that on the drill floor. It's going to be a big event, and we're going to have a really great time. And they close the armory on us. So we're working that through with Ireland and with the state and trying to get other places to do it. It's really a lot of fun working in the regiment. Any other questions? Sorry to bore you with this stuff. Any questions?
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. I'm sure that Amy and Colonel Trinity will be here if you have any private questions, but September 15th is the next presentation in the lecture series, and the show opens again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Have a good evening.